Poor girl flees pregnant with Duke's child. He searches the country. You and the baby are mine. On a cold, misty dawn in London, Ivy Clark pressed one hand to her belly and the other to the servant's door, easing it open without a sound. Her carpet bag held everything she owned, 2 dresses, her mother's prayer book, and the secret growing beneath her heart. She was 2 months pregnant with Duke Elias Ravenswood's child, and after what she'd overheard last night, she knew staying would destroy them both. "I won't let them call you a mistake," she whispered to the life inside her, stepping into the fog. "I won't let them make you disappear." Behind her, the great townhouse slept on, unaware that by morning everything would change. Hello, lovely. If you're enjoying this story of a woman who chose to run and a man who learned to chase what mattered, I'd be so grateful for a like or subscribe. It helps me bring you more tales where love means showing up, not giving up. And if you'd like, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Your presence makes these stories come alive. 1. Ivy Clark had learned early that poor girls didn't get happy endings. They got practical solutions. At 23, the vicar's daughter had buried both parents, lost her small inheritance to her father's debts, and taken the only respectable work available, companion to elderly Lady Ashworth, who spent half the year at Duke Elias Ravenswood's London townhouse. That's how Ivy had met him. Not at a ball or a garden party, but in a dusty library where she'd been fetching a book for Lady Ashworth, and he'd been hiding from his own dinner guests. "You're the companion," he'd said, not unkindly. "And you're the Duke who's supposed to be entertaining 40 people downstairs." He'd laughed, surprised, genuine laughter, and somehow that had been the beginning. Over months, their paths had crossed in quiet ways, conversations in corridors, shared books left on windowsills. A growing friendship that had become something more during a week at his country estate, when Lady Ashworth had taken ill and Ivy had stayed to help manage the household. She'd known it was foolish, known there was no future in loving a duke. But Elias had looked at her like she mattered, had listened to her opinions like they were worth hearing, had kissed her like she was precious rather than convenient. She'd let herself believe. Then, last night, she'd heard the truth. She'd been passing the library when voices drifted through the half-open door. Elias and his uncle, Lord Blackwood, the political adviser, who'd been pushing for months about advantageous matches. "The Ashworth girl is perfectly positioned," Blackwood had said. "The Earl's daughter. Excellent connections. You need her father's support for the factory reform bill." "I'm aware." "Then you understand this liaison with the companion must end. Cleanly, before anyone suspects." A pause. Then Elias's voice, carefully neutral. "She doesn't signify. A temporary distraction. It will be handled." Ivy had pressed her hand to the wall, feeling the world tilt beneath her feet. A temporary distraction. She'd fled to her room, hands shaking, and realized the nausea that had plagued her for weeks wasn't nerves or bad fish. She'd missed her courses twice. Her breasts ached. She was exhausted in ways that had nothing to do with work. She was pregnant, and she'd just heard the father of her child dismiss her as something to be handled. The practical part of Ivy's brain, the part that had survived poverty and loss, knew exactly what would happen if she stayed. At best, she'd be paid off and sent away, the child adopted or hidden. At worst, she'd be ruined publicly, and her baby would grow up as someone's shameful secret. She wouldn't trap Elias into a marriage that would destroy his career. She wouldn't beg him to choose her over duty, and she absolutely wouldn't let her child be treated as a problem to solve. So she ran. The stable boy was half asleep when she offered him her last coins for a seat on the mail coach heading north. He looked at her small bag, her pale face, and shrugged. "Top seats only, miss. Cold up there. I'll manage." She climbed onto the roof of the coach as dawn broke, wedging herself between luggage and a farmer's crates. The motion made her stomach heave immediately. A farmer's wife settled beside her, wrapped in a heavy shawl. She took one look at Ivy's greenish face and offered a stale bun. "You look worse than my cabbages after a frost, girl. You expecting?" Ivy nearly choked. "Just the motion. I don't travel well." The woman's eyes dropped to where Ivy's hand rested protectively over her belly. She clearly didn't believe a word, but had the kindness not to press. As the coach rattled away from London, Ivy watched the city disappear into morning mist and made herself a promise. She would build a life where her child was wanted, where they both belonged, even if it meant never seeing Elias Ravenswood again. Back at the townhouse, Elias woke late after a restless night. The conversation with his uncle had left a bitter taste, and he'd dreamed of Ivy's face, that particular expression she wore when she was trying not to laugh at his more ridiculous statements. He reached for the bell to summon her with his morning correspondence. They had a routine. She'd bring coffee and letters, and they'd steal 20 minutes of conversation before the day's demands began. The bell was answered by a nervous housemaid, not Ivy. "Where's Miss Clark?" "She, Your Grace, Miss Clark, has gone, left before dawn." The words didn't make sense. "Gone where?" "I don't know, Your Grace. She took her bag and just left." On his desk, Elias found a note in Ivy's careful handwriting. "Forgive me. It is better if I go. I see." He read it 3 times, waiting for it to make sense, for there to be more an explanation, a destination, anything. There was nothing. Elias stood in his study as the morning light strengthened, and for the first time in years, the composed, controlled Duke of Ravenswood felt something close to panic. She was gone, and he had no idea why. 2. The days that followed were a masterclass in mounting dread. Elias questioned every servant in the household. The housekeeper, Mrs. Patterson, finally admitted what she'd suspected but hadn't reported. "Miss Clark was unwell, Your Grace. Morning sickness, I thought, though she never said. And there was a day in the garden when she nearly fainted." "Morning sickness." "Yes, Your Grace." Mrs. Patterson's face was carefully neutral, but her meaning was clear. Elias sat down heavily. The physician he summoned confirmed the timeline. If Ivy had conceived during that week at the country estate, she'd be about 2 months along now. The realization crashed over him like ice water. Ivy hadn't just left. She'd run pregnant with his child. And she'd run because of him. Because of the words she must have overheard in the library. Words he hadn't even meant, spoken to appease his uncle, to buy time while he figured out how to protect her from exactly this kind of situation. She doesn't signify a temporary distraction. He'd called the woman he loved, and he did love her. He realized now with devastating clarity a distraction. And she'd believed him. Elias spent that night at his desk, writing careful instructions to his steward. Trace every mail coach that left London before dawn. Send inquiries to coaching inns on the northern routes. Offer rewards for information about a young woman travelling alone, using the name Ivy Clark or Mrs. Clark. His handwriting grew worse as the hours passed, fear making his hand unsteady. He didn't roar orders or threaten servants. He simply worked, methodically, desperately, trying to find a woman who clearly didn't want to be found. Meanwhile, Ivy arrived in Bridgemere after 3 days of miserable travel. The industrial town was everything London wasn't. Smoky, loud, crowded with workers rather than aristocrats. No one here would think to look for a duke's mistress. No one here would care about society scandals. She rented a cramped room above a baker's shop from Mrs. Fairchild, a widow with sharp eyes and a kind heart. The woman took one look at Ivy's pale face and bare ring finger and drew her own conclusions. "Young widow, are you? What did the dreadful man do to you, love?" "He died," Ivy said, which wasn't technically a lie. The man she'd thought Elias was had certainly died the moment she'd heard those words in the library. "Men," Mrs. Fairchild said darkly, "even when they go and die, they leave us with the mess." Ivy found work at a small dressmaker's shop, using the sewing skills her mother had taught her. The pay was poor, the hours long, and her morning sickness made the first weeks miserable. But it was honest work, and the other girls were kind. "You're too pale," said Martha, the senior seamstress. "And you jump every time a carriage goes past. What are you running from?" "Nothing interesting." "Liar. But don't worry, we've all got things we're running from." The shop had its own small comedies. The apprentice, Tom, pricked himself with needles, so often his fingers looked like pincushions. One wealthy client insisted on ordering a dress 3 sizes too small, convinced she'd fit into it by the season. But underneath the humour was Ivy's steady determination. Build something, create a life where her child would be wanted. She wrote nothing to London, left no trail, became Mrs. Clark, the quiet young widow with the London accent and the growing belly. And she tried, desperately, not to think about the man she'd left behind. 3 weeks after Ivy's disappearance, Elias sat in a grimy coaching inn 2 counties north of London, listening to an innkeeper describe a young woman who'd travelled on the roof of a mail coach. "Looked half frozen when she got down," the man said. "Wouldn't come inside for tea, just asked about the next coach going further north." "Did she say where she was headed?" "No, sir, but she bought a meat pie and didn't eat it, just held her stomach like it was bothering her." Elias's throat tightened. She'd been sick, alone, running from him. "Which direction?" "The Bridgemere coach, I think. Industrial town, lots of mills." That night, Elias wrote to his steward with instructions to focus the search on the northern industrial towns. Then he sat in his rented room, unable to sleep, staring at the water-stained ceiling. He'd never felt so helpless, never felt so responsible for someone else's pain. The composed Duke, who solved everyone's problems, had broken something he couldn't fix with money or influence. And every day that passed was another day Ivy spent alone, pregnant, believing he didn't want her. "I'm coming," he whispered to the darkness. "I'm still coming." But she already had weeks of head start, and she clearly didn't want to be found. 3. Months passed. The search spread across 3 counties. Elias travelled roads he'd never seen, stayed in inns he'd never have noticed from his carriage window. He learned that his ducal aura didn't impress everyone. Some innkeepers resented a nobleman asking questions. Others fawned in ways that made him uncomfortable. In one smoky common room he tried to sit like an ordinary traveller and failed spectacularly. His boots were too polished, his accent too refined. A farmer's wife looked at him with open amusement and said, "You're about as common as a golden goose, love." He found traces of Ivy everywhere, but never Ivy herself. A midwife in one town remembered selling a pregnancy handbook to a young woman who'd signed the ledger as Mrs. I. Clark. "Pretty thing," the woman said. "Scared, though. Asked a lot of questions about what to eat, how to stay healthy. Left a good tip and headed further north." "Toward the mills?" "That's what she said. Poor thing. Probably looking for work." Elias was sick with both relief and frustration. She was alive, still running. In Bridgemere, Ivy's life had settled into routine. Her belly showed now, round and unmistakable beneath her plain dresses. Mrs. Fairchild had appointed herself unofficial grandmother to the unborn child, forcing extra rolls on Ivy at every meal. "For the baby," she'd insist. "You're eating for two, love." At the dressmaker's, Ivy had become our Ivy, the quiet one with quick fingers and dry humour. The other seamstresses shared stories of useless men, difficult births, and survival against the odds. Ivy learned she wasn't the only woman who'd been hurt by someone powerful. "My sister's employer got her in trouble," Martha said one evening. "Rich merchant promised her everything. Then his wife found out, and my sister ended up on the street." "What happened to her?" "She's all right now. Married a decent man who didn't care about the past. But it took years." Tom, the apprentice, had developed an odd habit of talking to Ivy's belly during quiet moments. "Kick once, if you agree your mother works too hard," he'd say, pressing his ear to her stomach. "Ha! See? Even the baby thinks you should take a rest. The baby thinks you're ridiculous. The baby has excellent taste." Some nights, alone in her small room, Ivy let herself miss Elias. Not the Duke, not the title. The man who'd quoted poetry badly to make her laugh. Who'd listened to her opinions like they mattered. Who'd kissed her forehead after they'd made love, and murmured that she was the most surprising thing that had ever happened to him. Then she'd remember a temporary distraction. She'd clamp down on her heart and tell herself the baby was enough. Some nights she believed it. Most nights she didn't. Elias finally reached Bridgemere in the 7th month of his search. He'd grown thinner, worn from travel. His valet had long since returned to London in despair over the state of his master's wardrobe. Elias had learned to brush his own coats badly and to eat whatever the coaching inns served without complaint. The country was making him human. He walked into the bakery, where his steward's contacts said a Mrs. Clark bought bread every morning. The baker confirmed it immediately. Ivy, sweet girl, pregnant but she never complained, worked at the dressmaker's round the corner. Where is she now? Left yesterday, poor thing. Mrs. Fairchild's cousin offered her a position in a village nearby. Quite a place to have the baby. Which village? Alderby, I think. Small place. Good folk. Elias looked at the empty table by the window, a half-eaten bun still sitting on a plate. She'd been here, possibly sitting in that very chair, only hours ago. He closed his eyes and whispered to himself, "I'm still behind." But he was close now. Finally close. 4. Alderby was everything Bridgemere wasn't. Quiet, green, and so small that everyone knew everyone's business. Ivy had taken a position helping at the village school, mending books and tidying classrooms in exchange for a room in the schoolmistress's cottage. The children were fascinated by her belly and argued constantly about what the baby would prefer. "Jam," insisted young Thomas. "Honey," countered his sister Mary. "Everyone likes honey." "The baby likes quiet," Ivy said, laughing. "And children who finish their letters." For the first time since leaving London, she felt something like peace. The village accepted her as Mrs. Clark, the widow from the city. No one asked difficult questions. No one looked at her with suspicion. She was 8 months pregnant now, heavy and awkward, but content in a way she hadn't expected. The schoolmistress, Miss Abernathy, was kind and practical. The local women had already started knitting baby clothes. Maybe this was enough. Maybe she could build a whole life here, far from scandal and heartbreak. Then, on a cool September afternoon, school let out and children scattered into the lane, and Ivy saw a man on horseback who made her heart stop. Elias looked nothing like the polished duke she'd left in London. He was thinner, travel-worn, his coat dusty and his hair wind-blown. He dismounted awkwardly, legs clearly stiff from riding, and stood in the lane, staring at her like she was a ghost. For a long moment, neither moved. Ivy's hand went to her belly. Her first instinct was to run, but she was 8 months pregnant and exhausted, and she was so tired of running. Elias walked toward her slowly, as if approaching a deer that might bolt. Villagers stopped to watch. Children whispered, "Ivy!" Her name in his voice. She'd forgotten how it sounded. "You shouldn't be here." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "I've been looking for you for 7 months." He stopped a few feet away, close enough to touch, but not touching. "Across 3 counties, through every coaching inn in England." "Why?" "Why?" He looked at her like the question was absurd. "Because you left. Because I didn't know you were—" His eyes dropped to her belly, and something raw crossed his face. "Because I said things I didn't mean, and you believed them, and I've been terrified every day since that I'd lost you both. You called me a distraction. I know. I was trying to buy time with my uncle, trying to figure out how to protect you from exactly this scandal, gossip, being used as leverage. I never meant—" He stopped struggling, "but I said it, and you heard it, and I can't undo that." Ivy's eyes burned. "So why are you here?" "Because my mistake," Elias said quietly, "was letting you walk out my door without fighting for you." He took a breath, then spoke clearly enough for everyone watching to hear. "You and the baby are mine, Ivy. Not like possessions, like family. You are my responsibility, my choice, my heart. Our child is my heir, not some secret to be erased. I've already broken the engagement my uncle arranged. I've accepted the political consequences. I've told everyone who matters that I'm going to marry you, if you'll have me." A small boy from the school piped up. "Is he your husband, miss?" Another whispered loudly, "If he isn't, he should be. Look at his horse." Even Ivy almost laughed through her tears. But she couldn't just surrender. Couldn't let relief override the fear she'd carried for months. "You said I didn't signify. You stood in that library and called me temporary. I was wrong. I was a coward. I thought keeping us secret would protect you, and instead it nearly destroyed everything." Elias met her eyes directly. "I don't expect forgiveness. I just need you to know I'm not the man who said those words, or, if I was, I'm not anymore." "How can I trust that?" "You can't. Not yet. But I'm asking for the chance to prove it." He offered her no ultimatum, no demand. Just stood there in the village lane, dusty and exhausted, waiting for her to decide. "I need time," Ivy whispered. Elias nodded. "Then I'll wait. I'll take a room at the inn, stay in Alderby until you give birth, until you tell me to go. But I won't vanish while you raise our child alone. Not again." He turned and walked toward the village inn, leaving Ivy standing on the school steps with her heart racing and her certainties crumbling. He'd come. He'd actually come. The question was whether she was brave enough to let him stay. 5. Over the following weeks, Elias proved he meant what he'd said. He didn't pressure Ivy, didn't demand answers. Instead, he simply existed in Alderby, making himself useful in ways that had nothing to do with being a duke. When a storm damaged the schoolhouse roof, he helped repair it. When Miss Abernathy fell ill, he read stories to the children with surprising gentleness. When the local blacksmith needed an extra hand, Elias rolled up his sleeves and worked until his palms blistered. "You're terrible at this," the blacksmith said, amused. "I'm aware, but I can hold things steady while you hammer." "Fair enough. Most lords wouldn't bother." "I'm not most lords." He walked on the opposite side of the lane from Ivy, so the village gossips could watch and whisper. He tipped his hat politely when they crossed paths. He never pushed for more than she offered. And slowly, grudgingly, Alderby began to accept him. "He's not what I expected," Mrs. Fairchild admitted during one of her visits. "Most dukes would have sent lawyers, not chased a girl across 3 counties. Most dukes wouldn't have let me leave in the first place," Ivy said. "Maybe, but he's here now. That counts for something." One evening, when the autumn light was golden and the baby was kicking hard enough to make Ivy wince, she found Elias sitting alone on the stone wall by the church. "May I?" She gestured to the space beside him. He moved immediately. "Of course." They sat in silence for a moment, watching the sunset paint the village gold. "I keep waiting for you to leave," Ivy admitted. "To get bored, to realize this isn't the life you want." "This is exactly the life I want." Elias looked at her. "Not the title, not the politics. You, our child, something real." "I'm scared," she whispered, "of trusting you, of being hurt again." "I know, and I can't promise I won't make mistakes. But I can promise I'll be here, through the mistakes and the fear and all of it." "Why?" "Because you're the only person who's ever looked at me and seen something other than a title. Because you make me laugh when I want to be serious. Because I've been half alive since you left, and I don't want to spend the rest of my life that way." Ivy felt tears spill over. "If I marry you, I won't just be a duchess who stays quiet and looks decorative. I want work that matters. I want a say in how things run. I want everything," Elias finished. "I know, and you'll have it, your own projects, your own choices. I don't want a decorative wife, Ivy. I want you." She looked at him, this man who'd crossed England to find her, who'd rebuilt fences and read to children and waited patiently for weeks, who'd given up political alliances and society's approval for a chance to prove he'd changed. "Fine," she said, her voice cracking. "But if you ever call me a distraction again, I'm throwing your ducal boots in the pigsty." Elias laughed real, relieved laughter, very fair terms. They married in Alderby's small church 2 weeks later. No grand London spectacle, just a packed congregation of villagers and Mrs. Fairchild crying louder than anyone. Ivy wore a simple dress that hid nothing of her pregnancy. Elias wore his least damaged travelling coat and a smile that made him look years younger. "I, Elias, take you, Ivy. I, Ivy, take you, Elias." After the ceremony, the village held a celebration in the schoolyard. Children danced. The blacksmith played fiddle. Mrs. Fairchild insisted on feeding everyone twice. 3 weeks later, in a bedroom at Ravenswood Hall, Ivy gave birth to a healthy baby boy. The village midwife and a London doctor both attended, because Elias had insisted on every precaution. He'd been utterly useless in the birthing room, at first pacing, pale, making nervous jokes that made no one laugh. Then Ivy had grabbed his hand and crushed it during a contraction, and he'd knelt beside the bed and stayed there. "You're not alone," he whispered. "Not ever again." The baby arrived at dawn, squalling and red-faced and perfect. "He's beautiful," Ivy breathed, cradling the tiny body. "He looks like you." Elias touched one small hand with trembling fingers. "Thank God. He has your nose." Poor child. They named him after Ivy's father, William James Edward Ravenswood. The lawyers could sort out the formal titles later. For now, he was simply Will. Weeks later, they sat in the estate gardens while Will slept in Ivy's arms. The autumn flowers were fading, but the air was mild and sweet. "I still can't believe this is real," Ivy said softly. "Which part?" "All of it. Being here, being married to you, having a son who'll grow up legitimate and loved." She looked down at Will's sleeping face. I spent months convincing myself I'd never see you again. I spent months terrified I'd never find you. Elias reached over to touch her cheek. You and the baby are mine, Ivy, and I am yours. That's the part I didn't understand before, that it goes both ways. Good, she smiled, because I'm done running. Somewhere far beyond the estate, the gossip mills were still turning. The Duke of Ravenswood had married a vicar's daughter, a former companion, a woman with no fortune or family. Society would whisper about it for years. But, in this quiet corner of the country, a poor girl who'd once fled alone now sat with a duke who'd crossed England to find her proof that sometimes the most scandalous thing of all is a man who actually stays. Dear listeners, Elias and Ivy proved that real love isn't just about the moment you fall, it's about what you're willing to chase, what you're willing to sacrifice, and whether you show up when it matters most. That being someone's choice, not just their convenience, requires both people choosing each other again and again. If this story touched your heart, please show your support by liking this video and subscribing for more tales where love means pursuit and family means fighting for the people who matter. I'd love to hear your thoughts. What would you have done in Ivy's place? Would you have run or stayed? Share your reflections in the comments below. Until next time, may you find someone willing to cross whatever distance separates you, not to claim you as property, but to prove you're worth the journey. This is a reminder that sometimes the greatest love stories start with leaving and end with someone caring enough to follow.